Hi, everybody. I'm Dianne Devitt, and I'm very excited to be here today and begin discussing a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is security. My father was a detective with the New York City Police Department for 30 years, and actually one of the people responsible for the crime prevention unit. So I grew up very aware of not being afraid, but being cautious and being careful. And when I grew my career in the meetings and events industry, I actually produced a show called The Agenda Expo, and I remember so vividly in September 2000, as a part of the show, offering a session on security in meetings and events. And I think a whopping 9 or 10 people showed up to the session. Well, fast forward, and of course after our attack on September 11th, when we offered the security session, we had to make room for standing crowds, unfortunately, and an overflow in the room, because I think the awareness of the importance of security, especially in the meetings and events industry, where we're responsible for so many people in one place at one time, truly gained in popularity and attention, and an additional responsibility for the meeting planners as well as the corporations involved with them. So I am extremely excited today to have our guest speaker with us today, Joe Russo. Joe's Senior Vice President, Executive Protection, TNM Security. Did I get that right?
TNM, yes, you did.
TNM Protection Resources. Okay, thank you. So, Joe, I know you are fascinating to me with your background. Presidential detail, U.S. Secret Service. We worked with President Clinton and U.S. Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. You traveled the world. Mm-hmm. How many countries did you mention?
Well, my last 2 years as the agent in charge of President Clinton's Secret Service Division as the former president,
right.
I was in 60 countries in 2 years.
60 countries in 2 years,
yeah,
wow.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm just so curious to know, like, out of all of this, just before we get started on everything, is like how you got started with this and what gave you the inspiration, and then to get involved with the Secret Service is a big deal. So tell us a little bit about it.
It's a very, very interesting story about being in the right place at the right time, which I think most of our lives include that. So I went to college predominantly to play football, but I took criminal justice, and I have a BA in criminal justice. And the reason I did that was because one of my uncles who lived in the Bronx was a customs inspector.
Oh.
And he urged me and a couple of my cousins, I have a lot of them, to pursue a degree in criminal justice and possibly in law enforcement in the federal government. Mm-hmm. And really that's why I did that. But ironically, I was waiting to become a New Rochelle police officer up here in New Rochelle, New York. And while I was waiting to get on, I had to do something. I was married with a young child. I was working at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan in security with a date to go to the academy. And during the time that I was there in 1983, actually 82 and 83, President Reagan stayed there as the president.
Okay,
so
sure.
I had the opportunity to work with the Secret Service, who came in with President Reagan. And I was just a young kid out of college, very interested in the Secret Service. And they encouraged me to go down to the 6 World Trade Center, which was the U.S. Custom House at that time, and see the recruiter. Oh. And of course, I told them that I was not going to be Secret Service material. I grew up in New Rochelle. I was a bartender in New Rochelle. You
don't want me.
And I'm going to be a New Rochelle police officer, and that was good enough for me. But anyway, long story short, I did go down against my better judgment in the end of 1982, and applied, took the Treasury exam, which in those days covered the 4 agencies under Treasury: U.S. Secret Service, mm-hmm. Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, U.S. Customs, and the IRS.
Oh.
And so the Treasury exam covered all 4 of those agencies. I took it. It was a very difficult test. I passed it, and then went to work in the New Rochelle Police Department. Did not hear anything for 4 or 5 months. They finally figured out I wasn't Secret Service material. And then they started the background. They go to the neighborhood, they speak to references, they speak to people who knew you as a kid, they go to your schools. So that whole process actually took a year while I was on the police department. And in December of 1983,
So you didn't, I mean,
they offered
you
me-
didn't realize that during that time that the process had already,
At times I did, because people would call me
People,
and
they
tell
would
me
call
that, hey,
you and
somebody
say-
showed up at my door to ask about you.
isn't that it? Well, sure. Well, you know, I mean, as a civilian, I feel good about that.
Sure. Yeah, great, of course.
Because at least
Yeah.
they're vetting you, right?
And as the applicant, you feel bad about it because they're talking to people who you know you for real. You know?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
But
The neighborhood guys.
But astonishingly, they offered me the job on December 27th of 1983. I came down to the World Trade Center and swore in. I was still a New Rochelle police officer, but they wanted us to come down prior to the new year. And little did we know, they knew, that the retirement system for the Secret Service on January 1st of 1984, in 4 days, was changing from 20 to 25 years. I was the last group,
Wow.
literally, in the world, in the Secret Service to come on under the old 20-year retirement
Boy,
plan
I wish I applied.
by 4 days.
Oh, I wish I had applied.
Everybody who came on after me the next week, who came in after January, was in a new, less lucrative and longer
25.
retirement system. So I was very fortunate at that time, again, being in the right place at the right time. And really, that's how my career started.
You know, it's so interesting because, you know, when you always get told, think big, because you think I'm going to do the right thing, and which wouldn't have been anything wrong to be a police officer in New Rochelle. I mean, that's a very noble career, right? But the universe had bigger plans for you, didn't it? So then how did that morph into your presidential involvement? That must be an interesting story, huh?
Yes.
And that's the one thing we have in common, which we'll get to later, right?
Yeah, so back in the 80s, New York City was having a very, very difficult problem with counterfeit currency, U.S. currency.
Oh.
And so, as most people don't realize, the Secret Service was created in 1865, ironically the last bill that President Lincoln would sign on the day he was assassinated, by the way.
Oh, boy.
To bring the Secret Service into existence, not to protect the president, but to combat counterfeit currency. Post-Civil War, every state, for the most part, had its own currency. And so counterfeiting became a very big problem in the United States. So the president spun off this service, the U.S. Secret Service, and their only responsibility at that time was to defeat counterfeit currency.
Oh, my gosh.
And they were very successful in all those years. So fast forward to the 80s in New York City. For the first 9 years, my career, I was in New York. Predominantly for the first 5 or 6 of those, I was working counterfeit currency, mostly in Upper Manhattan, where we had a very big problem, up in Washington Heights, but citywide. All the different organizations, gangs, groups, the distribution process. It was a very interesting crime at that time, and it was all affiliated with drugs and weapons and counterfeit currency.
Sure.
So they were great cases, federally prosecuted cases. So really, I spent the most of my early career working counterfeit currency. And of course, we also worked on treasury checks, which were forged, altered, and stolen. In those days, everybody received their treasury check in their mailbox, right? So Social Security,
right.
pension, whatever it was. So we worked a lot of that. And then early 80s, 82, 83, the Secret Service expanded into financial crimes, which were credit cards at that time, and spun off into
Well, because
everything
credit
else.
cards really, I guess the proliferation really started around that time, right? I mean,
Right. So
more or less,
what
right?
happened was they really started to see an uptick in counterfeit credit cards. So
Right.
prior to that, it was stolen, forged, or altered credit cards, which the FBI and other federal agencies were working. But once they started counterfeiting them, the government felt that the Secret Service had the expertise in counterfeit currency,
Right.
and we were already stood up to do that, with the labs and so they brought us into that on the forensic side, and that became one of our big jurisdictions, cross-jurisdiction with other agencies.
Wow.
Whereas counterfeit was just ours.
Just
so I worked a
ours.
lot of that as well here in New York, of course, over the years. And then, of course, every September when the United Nations General Assembly comes to New York,
Sure, of course.
you would drop everything, put on a suit, and go work
Right.
at the United Nations. And the Secret Service was responsible for protecting any foreign head of state that visited these states. And, of course, in New York during the UN, I think these days they're up to about 180 heads of state. So you cut your teeth in protection doing advances and protection work for the UN. And then eventually, in order to advance your career, you were required in those days to transfer to Washington to be on one of the two big details, presidential detail or the vice presidential detail. I chose to go to the vice presidential detail. At that time in 1992, it was Dan Quayle.
Okay.
Little did any of us know, very similar to this last election, that Bush quail would lose to Clinton Gore.
Mm-hmm.
And so the governor from Arkansas became the president. And
Right.
so we went from Dan Quayle to Al Gore. And then I was with the Gores for about 3.5 years there before coming back to New York.
It's interesting. I mean, before I go forward, what's so fascinating is when it's not your world, like you talk about counterfeit, it's so foreign to me. Because why would I even think about that? The only money I know is monopoly money. That's not real in my wallet, right? But it's such a business, isn't it? It's
Sure.
like the good guys and the bad guys all around. But anyway, so I understand. So that's how you got involved. So you were involved with the vice president then for a while.
Yep, I was down there for 4 years. Volunteered to come back to New York, which is very easy to do because New York is a very difficult place to operate and work, as we all know, in any field, but certainly in the Secret Service it was very difficult because you weren't making a lot of money, trying to raise a family outside of the 5 boroughs, much like a police officer.
Right.
And commuting in every day, driving with your government car, and then trying to get around town and the 5 boroughs, doing the work. So it was always a challenge, and of course the cost of living. So it was a very hard to staff office, and it is the largest office in the Secret Service. You had, in those days, we had over 300 people in New York. So it was easy to come back, volunteer to come back, which I did because my son was going to the high school and they wanted to get back to New York. And that's how I returned to the field office for another 6 years.
Wow.
And became a supervisor in the office. At that time, in 1995, when I returned from Washington, we were in 7 World Trade.
All
we
right.
moved from the Customs House into 7 World Trade. So I went through all the squads again. I was in the protection squad and credit card squad and counterfeit squad, and then finally was promoted to be a supervisor, and I ran the credit card fraud squad, and then became the supervisor in charge of the protection squad, which was a very important role in the New York field office because you coordinated all of the big events, the UN's, presidential visits,
Right, exactly.
all the things that happen in New York every day. And unfortunately, we were in 7 World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. We were preparing for the United Nations General Assembly. I had not only all of our folks in the office, but we had another 120 or so up from Washington with all of their equipment and vehicles in the World Trade Center. And so we were in day 2 of planning and we were in the office that morning, of course, when the plane struck.
Oh, you were in the office.
We were, yep. And we obviously evacuated the building at some point and tried to account for all of our folks
Sure.
who were just arriving to work at that time. So
Did you?
many, many stories we did. We ended up losing one special officer who was up from Washington. He happened to be in the hotel, the Marriott, which was attached to the World Trade that morning. And so we were very fortunate because we were missing probably 200 to 300 people until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then, as history has it, our building collapsed from fire, really, which is the reason why 7 World Trade collapsed. The fire department just could not fight it.
Wow.
And so 7 collapsed. We watched our building come down, and with that, not that it was important at the time, but we lost all of our equipment, weapons, vehicles, everything we had in there from D.C. to get ready for the UN. And the next day, the largest protection squad in the world was out at JFK in the empty Tower Ed terminal with a pencil and a piece of paper to get ready for President Bush's visit in 3 days. So that was my experience through the protection squad.
Sort of
in New
like
York.
going back to the old pencil. I've had my experiences with Secret Service over the years, as you can imagine, being in events, right?
Sure.
And I remember one specific that I really irritated the whole bunch of you, by the way. But I was totally innocent. I was in Las Vegas, and I was given the responsibility to go meet then President Carter, who was coming in on a private jet. And so my car, of course, wasn't swept, wasn't cleared, wasn't cleaned. And I never forget my driver, Orville, because I didn't tell him what we were doing, and I directed him to the private airport, and we came in, we gave the gate, the flight, the plane number. And when we went through the gate, I'll never forget this, like 6 cars, 3 cars surrounded me on either side. They were all Secret Service, but I was the designated welcome person. And so I got out of the car and I stood next to the car, and President Carter, and he flew, actually I remember they flew with their best friends, another couple.
He was actually the former president.
Yes, former president.
And you were a greeter.
And I was a greeter. And I had actually worked with him prior. And so he came walking right up to me, hello, hello, Mr. President, welcome to Las Vegas. This is not Dianne, how are you? I said, I'm fine. He said, I'd really like to ride back to the hotel with you. Where is your car? So they just went into the car. That wasn't the only car that wasn't swept. So of course all the Secret Service they were going nuts, and they were so angry with me. I was like, where am I supposed to sit? Get in the back seat.
I'm surprised they took your car.
Well, they just kind of followed it along the strip, but it was just kind of interesting. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you for this segment, because we'll be back with you in a few minutes. But it's so interesting to see how this evolved, and I only say that because we're going to, in our next section, we'll get to the meetings and events, because this was years ago before this awareness was even created. So, Joe, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
All right, thank you, everyone.